Welcome to the first Kwazman Vwa conversation of 2024. We're kicking off what we are calling syllabus season, which means we'll be featuring a series of conversations with scholars of the Caribbean, foregrounding their recently published monographs. If you'd like to see what's coming up on our schedule, you can hop over to our website and we'll put that link into the chat, as well as our social media accounts. Today, we are welcoming Dr. Tegan Zimmerman to discuss her book, Matria Redux. That was really smart of me to have right there. Caribbean Women Novelize the Past, which was published with University Press of Mississippi in 2023. Dr. Zimmerman teaches at St. Mary's University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and she is the editor of Atlantis, Critical Studies in Gender, Culture, and Social Justice, as well as the chair of the International Comparative Literature Association's Comparative Gender Studies Research Committee. She specializes in contemporary gender theory and women's writing, with a concentration on Caribbean literature and historical fiction. In 2023, she published Matria Redux, as well as Chronotropics, Caribbean Women Writing Space-Time, which she co-edited with Odile Fernier. The following conversation will take the form of a round table, as each member of Kwazman Vwa poses a question, and this should last about 45 minutes, at which point we'll invite you, the audience, to pose questions to Dr. Zimmerman via the chat, or simply by speaking. I want to let you know that we are recording this and we will have the recorded conversation on our website. So if you don't want your likeness to appear, you can post questions via the chat and keep your camera off. And now I am going to pass the proverbial microphone over to my colleague Corinne Labridi, who will pose our first question.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn. And thank you so much, Dr. Zimmerman, for joining us. We all read your text with so much interest and we were chatting about it. So we're really excited to have you here. So I'll go ahead and, well, here and there. And so I'll go ahead and get us started. The texts in Matria Redux are works of historical fiction, broadly construed. Can you talk a bit about the function of this genre in Caribbean literature? And then why Matria? What is this concept and what drew you to it for this project?
Thank you, Corinne. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Yeah, thank you for that question. So what I think of as the function of historical fiction in Caribbean literature is to, I want to say tell and retell the past sort of simultaneously, because sometimes it's not just a matter of retelling, but perhaps telling something for the first time. And so I don't necessarily always see it as sort of this counter-reactionary type of writing. But at the same time, that being said, I do think it is challenging the perspectives which we have previously received, which are excluding women's lives and voices for the most part, right? And so we might think of the genre as a whole as a kind of counter voice or a counter narrative, especially to those master narratives told by the coloniality. But I also think that women's literature has to tackle the patriarchal tradition within the Caribbean as well, and that tradition of historiography and masculine definitions of history. So it's trying to do a lot. It has a lot. It has a lot to do. And I think that the women's novels then, part of their role is to reinforce or reaffirm the contributions of women and the importance of women's lives, not only in the past, but also in the present. And I think this results in a post-colonial feminist reconfiguration of the genre, if you will, and a redefining of what constitutes history or who constitutes history. And so where does Matria fit into this? So Matria is an imagined maternal space or motherland that I see these texts actively creating through mother-daughter relationships. And it's the mother-daughter relationship which forms the most important bond in the novels. It's central to the novels. And so I think, as Caroline Rhodey argues, there's a Caribbean romance with maternal history. And I certainly see that in the texts that I've studied. And again, contributing to that function of historical fiction is to recuperate the mother-daughter relation and retell it from another perspective. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. I think Nathan will be next.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Zimmerman. As a scholar working across various language traditions and contexts where mother tongues often clash with colonial or national languages, this is something we all compete with, right, as we're reading and interpreting literature from the Caribbean. Can you talk about the influence that translation had on defining your corpus or informing your approach to the panorama of novels you explore in Matria Redux? I particularly appreciated a footnote that you had about the inclusion or exclusion of glossaries in one of the novels that you explore. So yeah, anything you have to add about that, or that in particular, or translation in general?
Yeah, it is something that I felt challenged by when trying to decide which texts to include. And ultimately, it led to my decision to focus on texts that are written in English, first and foremost. But what I found tricky is that there are such important novels from the Francophone tradition, which I absolutely think have a bearing and deeply influenced the text that I'm studying. So as you can imagine, works by Maurice Condé, certainly something like Mwatituba would have had an enormous impact on these writers. And also I wanted to dig a little bit earlier because, and this is something I talk about a little bit, but that typically when we think about the Caribbean women's historical novel, it's Jean Rhys and Wide Sargasso Sea that comes to mind. And everyone's like, yes, like this is the, the quintessential counter narrative or post-colonial text. But it really has overshadowed some amazing works which come from the Francophone region, such as Marie Vieux Chauvet's Danse sur le Volcan. And I was like, this is absolutely a historical novel. And it was translated into English a year after, or even the same year that it was published in French. So it was hard for me not to sort of reference these French novels, specifically French novels. I didn't engage as much with the Hispanophone ones because it was the French tradition that I saw influencing these Anglophone texts the most. But I had to make that decision to say, okay, I can reference them, but I can't focus on them. And that was hard.
Yeah, I really appreciated the way that you just brought it back to Condé and Chauvet, because they were, I feel like the thinking of those novels and the way that they're working with mother-daughter relationships, especially with, if we look at Chauvet's Danse sur le Volcan, there's a lot of care, maternal care, that takes place in that novel, and that sort of works its way into the way that Chauvet herself cares for the history that she's telling.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in another life, I would like to focus on those early Francophone historical novels. And there are some Anglophone ones as well that really haven't been taken up by scholars. And I should say that I think it's this earlier period from like the 1950s to the 1980s that is more or less neglected because, as I mentioned, there's also Ada Quayle's The Mistress, which was published in the same year as Danse sur le Volcan. So so someone should write that.
I invite you to name check all sorts of authors and works that have not been as studied as much to your mind, especially in relation to mothers and daughters and telling women's history. I think that's one of the things that people come to our work for, is to find new works or find works that are understudied. So yeah, throughout the conversation, if anything comes up, please do mention that.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I just tag onto that, because I think it's relevant to Nathan's question, but at Kwazman Vwa, we're seeking in the long term to kind of read and study and engage with the Caribbean across these linguistic and national boundaries. And that's something that you take on in Matria Redux. And I'm wondering if you can just sort of speak to some of the challenges and potentially pleasant surprises or boons that you experience working across the Caribbean, which is quite a tall order.
Yeah, I think the risk, as I'm sure you're all aware, is oversimplification or overgeneralization, or somehow creating this notion of like a monolithic or homogenous region, right? Because we call it, we talk about the Caribbean, and maybe it brings to mind that everyone is sort of doing the same thing, when in fact, when you are working in a national tradition or culture, and you know that there's very much those differences exist. And so I think the challenge is to try to look for those recurring themes across writers and across geopolitical positions, but at the same time being very careful to also provide context, specific context for the writing as well, and recognizing those differences and not sort of turning a blind eye to those differences for the sake of having kind of a coherent narrative. So I guess that's the balance, isn't it? And I think it's quite difficult to do that. But if you can sort of keep that simultaneous heterogeneity and homogeneity in mind at the same time, I think that's a good strategy. At least that's the strategy that I tried to adopt in the book. Yeah.
If I could add too, is there anything, I don't know, did you ever want more like from what was available in translation, or like, did you ever feel like, I don't know, since you had that footnote about, I forget the name of the particular novel, but in one edition of it, there was no glossary. And then later it was published with a glossary, even though you pointed out, especially in your citation of the scholar critiquing the inclusion of that glossary, that like, the Spanish was already comprehensible, and the author had already done work to create access for non-Spanish speakers to access that work. Since you're working in English on these novels, oftentimes in translation, did translators or the work of translators or the work of publishers ever leave you wanting more, feeling like the Caribbean was mishandled in translation?
Yeah, that's good. A good point. And it's the meaning of Consuelo, which is the novel that has the glossary added to it. And as you were talking, I was thinking as well, like other Hispanophone novels, something like Julia Alvarez's work, there's never a glossary. And I think she does do a good job of what she calls sort of Spanglish, like in The Time of the Butterflies, she apologizes for her Spanglish, but it does infuse the novel with a sense of its literary heritage. And you do get a sense of the Dominican Republic, I think, through the blending of the Spanish that she has and the English. And so, yeah, I think it's, again, kind of pandering, or maybe not giving the reader enough credit at the same time. Like, I really don't think with the meaning of Consuelo that it is necessary at all for a reader to have this glossary. And some of my maybe more cynical attitude is that it's about money. It's about getting more people to read this book. It's about selling the books to begin with. And so maybe an Anglophone reader who comes to it and thinks, oh, well, there's no glossary, I don't want to look this stuff up. Like, it's assuming, I suppose, in an uncharitable way, that the reader is lazy or will be somehow put off, when I really don't think that's the case. In fact, I think readers want that challenge. They want to maybe learn something about a time and place that they did not know that much about before, and to have a more genuine reading of the novel. And so for your question about wanting more, I guess I would like more Hispanophone novels that are written in Spanish, translated into English. There did seem to be a gap when I was doing my research. The French novels are more readily translated. And that may also have to do with the politics of where these Hispanophone islands lie. That could be part of the conversation. Are they part of the Caribbean? Are they not? Which literary tradition do they belong to? And so I won't keep going, but I don't know if that answers your question. But
absolutely, yeah. No, I just wanted your honest assessment of,
Yeah.
how you felt, in the field, in the area. And I think, to your point, a lot of the times the Hispanophone Caribbean does get kind of lost in Latin America, in
Yes.
a way.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so I'll pass the baton to Lucy to ask another question.
Yeah, thank you so much. And this actually, I think, follows nicely because it's a question about the place of Francophone writers and thinkers in your book. I was really intrigued by your reading of Diane Brand's At the Full and Change of the Moon. And I was wondering if you could say more about Glissant's concept of the rhizome, and specifically in a family tree, that you put the rhizome and the family tree into dialogue and sort of complicate the idea of the family tree in this way. But the novel also includes a matriarch who uses, as you mentioned, abortion as a tool of resistance, among others. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I have to say all of the questions were excellent. I was thinking a little bit about this, and my response would be that I think with Marie Ursule, abortion is used as a means of resistance against the master and against slavery. But she chooses to have Bola, right? She wants to have Bola, and Bola's father in the novel is ambiguous. Like, we're not sure if it's Kamina, we're not sure if it's the master. There's various hints maybe to support both readings. And so I think the fact that Bola is an example of Maria Serule's autonomy and self-determination is really why this route, the first route, works, and then allows Bola to exemplify the rhizomatic route afterwards. Like, I guess maybe what I'm saying here too is that you can't have the rhizomatic route without the arbolic route. But the arbolic route doesn't have to be interpreted necessarily in this patriarchal way, which is sort of the traditional reading of the arbolic route as sort of, patrilineal and filial and all these things, and singular, etc. I think what Brand is doing is actually saying you have to read both together. It's not okay to have one or the other, because Brand certainly doesn't want to just reappropriate the patriarchal arbolic route and just offer a women's version of it. That's not going to change anything. What you need is that dynamic between the arbolic and the rhizomatic. And I think there's also the suggestion that with Glissant, and you have this rhizomatic route spreading out, but you still have that beginning, like you still have that trace, or that what do I want to say, like the more firm root that anchors the rhizomatic genealogy. And I think for Brand, that is Marie Ursule. And so as that constant negotiation. And I was thinking too, like there's a character later on in the novel who says, I wanted that line, right? I wanted that route to my mother because she hasn't had it. And so Brand again is trying to offer a new type of genealogy where the mother is central. And I think, again, focusing on mothers in relation to the rhizomatic root is something quite inventive and something that we don't get from Glissant. I mean, maybe some of you are more familiar with Glissant's work than I am, but he never mentions mothers, to the best of my knowledge, and he rarely mentions gender. And so you could say, well, he's considering everyone as equal, so why have this gender difference? But I think Brand is saying actually gender matters, and the mother matters, and we need to rethink mother-daughter relationships and how those can adhere or not adhere to the traditional understanding of Glissant's rhizome, as well as the traditional patriarchal arbolic root as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's really interesting response. And then I think I'm passing the baton back to Jocelyn for the next question.
Yeah, exactly. We're moving sort of into the second section of Matria Redux, in the section Decolonizing Matria. You propose that the coming of age of a female protagonist parallels that of post-colonial nation or anti-colonial movement, right? This kind of Bildungsroman that reflects back on national identity as well as the identity of the protagonist. And that the divorce from colonial values also means a rupture between an anti-colonial daughter and a mother who, and I loved how you put this, so I'll quote from you, imperfectly ventriloquizes the colonizer's rhetoric. Can you speak a little bit to this kind of in-between maternal figure who's lost between these different, these shifting government logics?
Yeah, so I think the mother in these cases becomes a little bit of a scapegoat. And that is a problem that I think the authors are trying to identify or recognize through representing the relationship between the mother and the daughter. So it's the case that in both the coloniality and in the post-colonial movement, the mother is going to get left behind. I think that's what the novels are trying to critique is, so how do we get out of this space where I think you rightfully say, like the mother is in this in-between space, right? As if she doesn't exist. Or if she does exist, it's in a negative relation to others, including her own daughter. And so this is problematic for Caribbean mothers and daughters. And you see that in these novels. So if your trajectory from childhood to adolescence entails rejecting your mother and then never reconciling with her, that is an issue. And I think the promise that post-colonialism offered women did not fulfill on its promise to re-theorizing gender. And I think that's what these novels are critiquing, is this split. Why have this rupture with the mother? Why leave the mother in this abject condition? Why can't we bring her, into full subjectivity like the daughter? Because presumably the daughter will also follow in the footsteps of the mother and become the mother, so that this cycle repeats itself. Yeah.
I have just like a little follow-up question on that.
Yeah.
About your corpus, and thank you. I found the description of this kind of archetypal in-between figure heartbreaking, but very fascinating. So this is at play in The Last English Patient and the Meaning of Consuelo, right?
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you would consider the text that you take up in your final section, so Praise Song for the Widow and Unburnable, to offer sort of maybe counter examples of a different model of this linking mother figure.
Yeah. So in those two novels, in the end, what is interesting, I think, is that, so in Praise Song for the Widow, Avi's mother, again, almost comes across as in the same way that Lucille does in The Last English Plantation. Avi more or less criticizes her mother for being for subscribing too much to the white society in which she lives and trying to fit in, whereas the Aunt CUNY is the exact opposite, is a rebel and is trying to teach young Avi and then later older Avi the same lesson about the importance of the past and retelling those stories of their ancestors, specifically their maternal ancestry. With the Meaning of Consuelo and thinking about that in relation to Unburnable, I think Unburnable ends on a poetic note, but also quite a tragic note, right? Because the character Lillian is isolated from her maternal kin. Both of her mother and her grandmother are dead when she returns to the Caribbean. And so there isn't a mother figure to whom she can turn to get those maternal stories, to relearn her maternal heritage. And so you maybe could argue, that the Avi and the Lillian figure perhaps are the result of the adolescence of someone like Consuelo in The Meaning of Consuelo, or of June in Scheinborn's novel. So maybe what happens if you reject your link to the maternal past and you accept the patriarchal space or post-colonial space in which you live, which tells you that your mother isn't of much value outside of maybe her motherly duties. I don't know if that answered your question, but feel free to prod me.
Yeah, I think that it does. Yeah, it's fascinating how many kind of varieties of mother-daughter relationships to each other and then to their national or cultural identities are at play across all of these texts. I'm going to give Jen the opportunity to pose a question.
Thank you. And since you were just talking about the Shineborn's novel, my question is actually taking us there, but not from the perspective of the mother-daughter relationship so much, but the Indo-Caribbean identities that you bring into focus in your conversation of that novel. So my question, I guess, is kind of like a two-step question. The first one has to do with the absence or marginality of those historically called coolie in the Caribbean discourses of Créolité, the kind of the Caribbean canon that you were discussing earlier. You were talking about, for instance, the absence of gender in glissant discourses. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit to this historical absence or this historical marginality of coolie figures in Caribbean discourses of Créolité, and how you are sort of recuperating that figure and reinventing that figure as well. And you're also using this sort of decolonizing approach to the coolie figure. And my second question has to do with your interventions. So how do we redefine Créolité in light of the expansion of corpus to include matrilineal Indo-Caribbean identities that your work supports? So that's why the two-step is kind of like, addressing the absence, and then what are you proposing through that inclusion of matrilineal Indo-Caribbean identities? Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. So Brenda Mehta would say that part of the issue is that intersectional identities aren't being taken enough into consideration when it comes to the Indo-Caribbean woman writer. And so instead, the focus may be on writers from India, or it may be on male writers or something like that. And what's happening is that someone like the character of June, who has Chinese and Indian heritage in Guyana, is having to choose between one aspect of her identity at the risk of losing the other. And so there really isn't a space for that intersectional identity. And I think that's what Shineborn is trying to do, is to say that whenever we think about identity in the region, we can't just think of it in these really rigid ways and these binaries, because we're excluding many people, including someone like June. And so I was thinking about this as well, because so Mehta also says that there is, when it comes to indentured labor in the region, which was, a form of slavery, it's not always recognized as a form of slavery, and that's a problem first and foremost. But that women made up a large part of this population, and there is no what she calls like a mother text or founding text from which writers can draw from. So for instance, maybe someone like Dion Brand is using a reference to Thisbe, who is a historical figure. However fragmented and limited that source is, she's still using it to kind of anchor her character, Marie Rasool. Here, Shineborn doesn't have that luxury. And so she really is going to have to invent and reimagine, and she's going to have to use personal stories. And she's going to have to talk to people and hear about their families and the generations of their families and their experiences, and try to capture that through her character of June Lahal. And even that absence is present when you look at how June's Indian heritage has come to dominate her Chinese heritage, right? And even the changing of the last name. And what's interesting, I think, to me, is that it's the figure of Nanny who tells June about her Chinese heritage. And so again, I think Scheinborn is identifying elders as important knowledge keepers and repositories of memories, and they're the ones who tell the stories. And so it's turning to them for these alternative versions, or these all for information about these lives that's really at stake and is super important. And so how it fits into Créolité, I think, is that, again, similar to the critique of Glissant, is that it's very much this, it should be this idea of intersectionality in theory, right? But it forgets gender, I think. I think I think most would agree that by and large, at least early versions of Créolité focused on men's experiences, and were not overly concerned with the experiences of women, let alone the lives of mothers and daughters. And I think Scheinborn does a really good job of showing us a different version of Créolité, one that can take into consideration the indentured servitude past, and also how that would impact the lives of mothers and daughters, not only from the past, but also in that sort of present moment in which the novel is set, which is like 1950 or so. But yeah.
Thank you so much for that. And then actually, even if then the mother-daughter relationship is actually very, very kind of ruptured, and there's this fracture between mother and daughter, it seems that the text is very much a space of recovery of matrilineal relationship. And like, as you were saying, with the figure of the grandmother, to whom she turns to whom the daughter turns to, and then also recovery in the sense that, as you're saying, it's doing this work of constituting a corpus and almost an archive of untold stories around indentured labor in the context of the Caribbean.
Yeah, absolutely. In many ways, it is functioning as a history in this way, right? Because of the lack of historical sources written from the indentured servant's perspective. Yeah, good. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And I think the next question will be coming from Corinne.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer.
So I'd like to invite you to expand on something you started talking about when answering Jocelyn's question. So in the last section of Matria Redux, you have this really rich conversation on various forms of madness. Mm-hmm. And obviously you point out, Jocelyn, that madness is nothing new in Caribbean literatures, but what I really appreciate is that you go on to nuance or to give different definitions, and specifically you speak about hystérie, which you use in French. And so writing specifically about Mary Elena John's novel Unburnable, you say that a character's hysteria can be accredited in part to a lack of post-colonial feminist support in the character's life. Yeah. Which I thought that was a brilliant formulation, but also I think it was a perfect illustration of the kinds of new readings that can happen when you bring together psychological and post-colonial studies. I think that one of the first moves that you identify as Matria Redux doing is sort of addressing these blind spots, the blind spot of race in psychology and the blind spot of gender in post-colonial studies. And so I was wondering if you could perhaps elaborate on this notion of hystérie or hysteria, sort of how it allows us to visibly understand this hinge between post-colonial and psychological studies.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So for hysteria, I read hysteria as this triangulation of history, madness, and womb, right? So sort of using the root of the word. And I also think of it as a mirror to history. And so I see the woman who is hysteric, like Lillian in John's novel, as actually holding a mirror to history to show us how she has had to not only repress her maternal heritage, but to basically give it up, in a sense, right? She has to almost pretend as if it doesn't exist because her maternal ancestors have been slandered in both the sort of the island's oral histories, and there's the songs that they make, the folk songs about her mother and her grandmother, but then there's also the official colonial record, which also denigrates both the mother and the grandmother. And so I think Lillian's response to this erupts as hysteria, right? Because I think John sort of poses the question, how does someone overcome this, right? And the idea, I think, sort of, again, maybe mimicking someone like Bertha Mason in, well, I guess Jane Eyre and Wide Cirque SOC is when she takes her own life, right? Maybe that's a sign of resistance, but it's not a very satisfying one. From a practical perspective. And I think what the novel does as well is with something like Wide Cirque SOC, the mad figure is Creole. And here the characters are not Creole, right? So she has indigenous and African ancestry. And I think she does a really good job of reminding us of the extreme cruelty and genocides that the indigenous suffered under the hands of coloniality. So really, it's a response, I think, to those monumental events in history that have affected her life and affected her mother and her grandmother. And so hysteria actually comes out looking like a very reasonable and logical response to such an illogical and unreasonable society. Yeah.
Yes, in a sense, it's a Fanonian response, right? How can you be sane in a completely mad world?
Yeah.
But I also think that you hinted at moments in which madness can be an obvious result of historical circumstances, but also sometimes a sort of a pause, a moment where a character draws back within. It's also a protection. It's sort of it can be it's definitely a multi-layered process that can both be a logical reaction, but also a moment of almost, I know that the term is overused, but almost a moment of self-care.
Yes, I think you're right. And also just the isolation that the characters face as well, right? And so I think going back to Jocelyn's comment as well, so the characters at the end of section 2, so for instance, Consuelo, it's ambiguous whether she's going to have to abandon her family entirely in order to move forward into the kind of feminist or creative life that she wants. And is that the kind of society which we want to uphold and support? Absolutely not. Like, maybe she too, we could imagine later in life suffering something similar because she has had to cut herself off from her maternal heritage, which, again, could result in some kind of form of hysteria, right? Yeah.
And I'm gonna try to sandwich a couple questions here as our last question from us, and then we'll open it up to the folks who have joined us here. So we have this question about Praise Song for the Widow and how you write about an attempt to revalorize other ways of knowing, particularly with attention to African-based cosmologies and oral history and the oral tradition. And also, I noted in your reading of the long song, how sort of writing can kind of get in the way of filtering these, or allowing the oral tradition or matrilineal traditions of storytelling and things like that to come through in writing, particularly with male editors or genres like the slave narrative and all of the mediation that takes place in that genre. So could you maybe help us think through how orality, language, the oral tradition, gossip, even maybe stories that are heard and then retold or refashioned, fill these novels or filter into these novels in your readings?
Yeah, one of the things that interests me a lot in Caribbean women's writing is the role of voice and how we access those voices, and it's complicated and layered. Most of the novels, I think, are polyphonic in the sense that there's multiple figures who speak at different times in the text, and sort of getting to the narrator, the true narrator, if you will, that omniscient narrator that is traditional, is really challenging, and it's almost rejected. And what I think is interesting about the orality of these novels is clearly these novels are written down when we are reading them, so that adds another layer to it. But it's how can you faithfully relay the oral tradition in a way that doesn't betray it when you translate it, let's say, into writing. And I think the claim that you brought up, that a lot of the time, it may be a male dominated genre, or there's masculine expectations around how voice is presented, is something that these novelists and these writers are tackling, because the historical novel genre, I should say, is also typically considered to be kind of a masculine genre, for the very reason that when we think of history, we think of wars and the great deeds of men and all of this, right? So these women writers are really trying to contest these preconceived notions of history, and also voice, and whose voice has authority. So if you are reading a historical narrative written by someone who was enslaved, then undoubtedly that narrative is going to be filtered through the hands and the eyes of a white male editor, right? And I think that Levy, for instance, would say that is inescapable. But what can you do? And so I think by giving, in that novel, July, the power to kind of interrupt and interject throughout the narrative, it really it brings our attention back. Oh yes, this is a construction. I am not reading necessarily something as it was said. So you have to be somewhat cautious, I think, that unreliable narrator. At the same time, the narrative that July gives us is deeply impactful and meaningful. And we don't want to just say it's a pure construction without any factual basis whatsoever, simply because it was filtered through her son or a white male editor. And so I think that's a really difficult negotiation that we have to acknowledge when reading these texts, but that often it's the songs, it's the myths, it's the rituals, it's the stories that give women this embodied knowledge. Or this sort of, if we think of, again, the mother figure, it's a different kind of knowledge that the mother has, and she's trying to assert that this knowledge is equally as valuable as any other kind of knowledge, and we need to rethink stories, or what we usually think of the oral culture as being inferior. We need to rethink these categories and reject those kind of binaries as well.
Yeah, I really appreciated in your discussion of the long song how you talk about Kitty, or maybe it's July, sort of thumbing through the library of these white women's grievance books, and sort of like saying, I know exactly what these are all about, and let me tell you what they're not about.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I think now we're going to probably pivot towards questions from the folks that have joined us.
Yeah, and I'll remind you, just in case you weren't here at the top, so our meeting is being recorded. So if you don't want your voice or your image to appear, you can just keep those off and type into the chat as you like. And perhaps giving the members of the audience a moment to reflect and come up with the question. I wondered, Tegan, if you could talk a tiny bit about your other book that's come out this last year, Chronotropics. If there, tell us a little bit of what that is about, and if there may be some bridges in sort of what you're up to these days.
Yeah. So I reached out to Odile in way back in like 2019 because I was really interested. My work in historical fiction made me interested in in these historical novels, sometimes they are set on fictional islands. So for instance, Tatum, in Marshall's novel, or I was thinking of like Shani Mutu's novels. If you're familiar with those are usually fictionalized islands or settings. And so I was kind of curious about how we can read those novels through the lens of the historical novel genre when they are set on fictional islands. Like that kind of defies usually one of the components of a historical novel, which is that it would have a historical setting. And anyway, so after discussing this with Odile, the project kind of took a bit more of a curve, and we decided we wanted to look at not space and time as restricted to the past, but as something that is fluid and open, and how contemporary women's writing in the region is, again, sort of challenging not only the Western, Anglo-American, European tradition of history is sort of linear and progressive and teleological, but how maybe women's time could be fluid and multiple, and what kind of narratives are women generating. So that's kind of the, again, it's a recuperation of epistemologies, cosmologies, and sort of ways of knowing and being that have been either rejected as false, and it's trying to reaffirm those knowledges as extremely important and central to women's writing right now. Yeah.
Thank you. That sounds such a wonderful concept. So I'm excited to check that out as well. So we'll just open up the floor. If there are questions that anybody can just light up your mic. So you have it.
I had a question about your corpus, or a wider corpus, not necessarily the one that you have in Matria Redux. I'm currently reading Gail Octavia's text, Madeleine Demetrius, where you find a relationship between mother and daughter, a very tense relationship between mother and daughter, where the daughter is kind of very much sort of battling with her mother in a way. She's refusing to stand as a strong mother figure, for instance. She's just choosing this very vulnerable side of motherhood. And so I was wondering if there's any figuration of vulnerability in mother figures that could act as a form of, if not subversion, at least a challenge to representation of strong motherhood, very much in the sense of, the Potomitan figure, where you have the construction of matriarchy, but at the same time in a very patriarchal ideology. So I was wondering then if vulnerability is something that you find in any way in your corpus around mother-daughter relationship, or just about mothers specifically?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. My initial response, I think, is that all of the mothers are vulnerable, but we are only being shown maybe their stronger sides typically. Because as you were speaking, I was thinking, yeah, I think in every novel, the mothers are considered to be quite strong figures. And then I was thinking about John's Unburnable, where we have the figure of Iris, who is Lillian's mother. And although the grandmother figure is in that sort of stereotypical way very strong, and the maroon matriarch, the daughter is not. And in fact, she's deeply vulnerable, after she has this illicit affair with Jean-Baptiste, and she is battling an addiction to alcohol, and part of that comes from the fact that she has been separated from Lillian, her daughter. And so I think there is that grief, there is that loss, and an inability to cope on the mother's part. So that's just one example that I was thinking of. But I'm sure there is maybe underneath the facade of the strength, there is that layer of vulnerability. It's a response, maybe, right? Like trying to arm yourself against the patriarchal colonial society in which you find yourself. But yeah, it's an excellent question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Just give a few moments to see if anybody else has something else that they're hoping to add.
Perhaps.
Go ahead, Karine.
Okay. I have perhaps a question about sort of possibilities of these mother-daughter relationships. And I know that might sound a little bit out there, but sort of articulated beyond gender, right? In a certain way. And I suppose the Caribbean in many ways currently really seems to, on the surface, although, you know, deeper, the story is a little bit different, but on the surface, the Caribbean really seems to stick to the gender binary. And so I was wondering if perhaps in some of your works that there were moments in which these relationships could be articulated beyond genre, or maybe another question would be, are there supportive fathers, or are there supportive male characters that would also be willing to support and nurture these mother-daughter relationships? Or is it maybe not the right moment for this?
Yeah, that's a very good question too, because I do find at least through my readings that typically the father is absent, and or is not a very, you know, sort of likable, reliable figure. But that being said, one exception I think is in Brand's novel when you have Kamina and he takes Bola and sort of flees the plantation, and he is a caring fatherly figure to her, although I mean their lives together are short-lived. I think they're only together for 3 or 4 years. But yeah, it seems like the recuperation of a different kind of father figure is missing in these novels, and perhaps there are others that I can think of later that will come to mind. I'm like, yeah, that would be a really great example of this loving fatherly figure. But for the most part, in the novels discussed, it's not really the case. And then what also is kind of interesting is that those characters who break gender or heteronormativity and expectations tend to be men. So for instance, in The Meaning of Consuelo, it's her cousin Patricio who comes out of the closet and then is punished by being sent to, being punished by being sent to New York, which is where he wants to go anyway. But still, it means the loss of his family because of it. And he loses his father. And what's interesting, I think, in those novels too, is that in this case, the homosexuality, Patricio's homosexuality is blamed not on the father who is alive and looking after him, it's blamed on his dead mother. So yeah, so there's a lot going on, I think, and so maybe the good dad is still to come.
I wonder, this is so interesting that I had to jump in. That
yeah, no, good.
That I'm just thinking this description of this cousin of Patricio being sent away and then kind of mapping this deviance onto a dead mother. Both of those are ways to displace and sort of erase something that's not fitting into the fold of reality as it must be, right, in order to confirm everything that's happening. And I wonder if, in a sort of reversal of that same kind of gesture, if the absence of supportive paternal or other masculine figures in many of these novels, it's because the masculine must be displaced, maybe temporarily, pushed away in order to create a space where Matria can just sort of start to burgeon, and that maybe he can be brought back into the fold.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah, that's an excellent question, observation. I also think too that it's interesting that you say this, because in the same novel, Consuelo's mother is also blamed for the daughter's bad behavior, and her you know, her early indulgences in sexuality. So it's an interesting one, because the mother really doesn't have power, right? But yet she can be blamed for her children's failings, when really it's the father who's in charge of the household, at least in these patriarchal kind of traditional settings. And yet the father wants to absolve himself of responsibility for the family when it doesn't follow that traditional narrative. So there's some sort of contradiction happening here, kind of like a false power, right? How can you blame someone who has no power to begin with? I don't know if that feeds into what you were thinking, but yeah.
It does. And I realize that now the time has flown and I stepped right on Nathan's question. I think we can take a moment if you want to still pose your question, Nathan. Otherwise we can.
Well, I was just curious, and this is probably the best way to end. What are the things that you have that you're, you know, dreaming about research-wise, or what are your next steps? You've had a momentous year with 2 books coming out.
Yeah,
So
I think a nap is in my is in my dreams.
I want to tack on just a tiny bit. Then what are you reading right now? We're super nervous.
yeah.
Oh, actually, I am reading Mario Vargas Llosa's The Feast of the Goat. Yeah, I'm rereading In the Time of the Butterflies. And I'm rereading The Farming of Bones, and now I'm reading The Feast of the Goat. Is sort of, I'm trying to think of all these truista narratives and making sense of them. Yeah.
Love that.
Yeah, it's a pretty I don't know, I'm sure most of you have read it, but it's a pretty difficult read at times. Yeah.
We'll say bye to Jen, and I'll just close us out. I know I have a growing reading list from this conversation, which I always appreciate. So I want to thank Tegan Zimmerman so much for coming and having this engaging conversation. And then also just to let everyone know that we have another conversation in the Syllabus Season series coming up on February 28th. That will be with Grace Sanders Johnson around her monograph, White Gloves, Black Nation. So we'll be looking forward to that. You can tune in on our website. And I don't know, everyone stay warm, stay comfortable.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your very thoughtful questions. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Thank you.